Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to my deep dive series. We're at the end of the season where I'm diving deep into each team and trying to compare where they landed around the teams around them in that constructor standings, and dive into that team members for those drivers and figure out and compare them to the drivers around them in the Drivers' Championship. Now, we dive into Aston Martin today, and we'll look at them. And we can see that they dropped from 5th from last year to 7th this year. Now, they did that because they mainly prioritized, at least that's my opinion, they prioritized the 2026 car over this year's ending of these regulations. And so, and this also includes the switch from the engine to a Honda engine next year. So that was trying to switch things around, and they weren't quite getting all the input and upgrades that they needed this year. Their car did have some issues this year in those low speed corners, not gaining the speed like the other teams did. And so that kind of hurt them in some of these tracks as well. We also see that Stroll had some inconsistencies, while Alonso had a lot of car issues that ended up in some DNFs that didn't help them at all in this run. Now, if you go look at the team members themselves, you can see that Stroll in the sprint qualifying session only out-qualified Alonso 1 out of 6 times. Now, in the actual sprint races themselves, it was a little bit better, and he managed to outbeat Alonso 4 out of 6 times in those sprint races. If you move to the GP races, Stroll out-qualified Alonso 1 out of 24 times, so that's quite a bit bigger stint on those GP races. It didn't quite make up in those qualifying sessions, so he needs a little bit of work on qualifying to get that little gathered up so it can get higher up in the grid, due to those races. Now, he did a little bit better on the ending with a 8 out of 24 times out of those GP races, out finishing his teammate Alonso. So if you flip that back around, just to give you that perspective, if you don't want to do the math, so it's, Alonso out sprint qualified Stroll 5 out of 6 times, so only once did he lose out from that sprint qualifying. And for the performance of those sprint races, he outperformed Stroll 2 out of the 6 times on those sprint races. Now, for the GP races, he outqualified 23 out of the 24 times he outqualified Stroll. So that's a big whopping one directional, outqualifying session. And he outperformed in the GP races 16 out of the 24 times that he beat Stroll in those GP races. So more than half that he beat those. Now, Stroll was coming back a little bit in those GP races, but he did not enough to really help out that team tremendously. So he had those spurts of good fortune. And I think mainly it was because he gets in those moods where he doesn't like the car, the setup, and so he doesn't actually perform or want to perform enough to get the most out of that car to potentially get those rankings. And so hopefully that'll change as they come into the next year where they'll have a better performing car, and so his mind and ability will be more synced up throughout the whole season. Now, here's a little chart that kind of gives you a little rough down on the Aston Martin season, where they, of course, started off 5th last year and ended up in 7th, so they dropped a few places this year in that running. On the average sprint qualifying positions, they did a 10.8, and the average sprint finishing position was a 12.3. So not in those points, kind of outside those points, getting closer to those in the qualifying sessions, but not really pushing forward in the sprint races themselves. Now, if you look at the GP races, they started off in 12.9 position for the qualifying session and ended up basically in the same spot in 12.8 in the finishing position. So they gained just a tad, but not enough to really gain that extra position. And of course, outside those points on average, so that kind of keep them at the bottom field of this, constructor standings. Now, they had 3 DNFs in sprint qualifying, or in the sprint races, and 7 out of the GP races. So quite a few DNFs altogether for Aston Martin. Now, if we break that down by the team members, we can see that Lance Stroll was 13th last year and went down to 16th this year. His average sprint qualifying was 13.1, and he moved up to 12th position on those sprint races. So it gained a little bit of ground on those sprint races, but again, not in those points on average, so that kind of hurt him in that regard. And it was a few places down from those point positions on those sprint races, so it didn't really help them gain a lot of points in that running when he did well. Now, his average starting position in the GP races was a 15.6, so pretty far back. And he did move up a little bit on the finishing position on those GP races to a 13.8. So he gained a couple of positions on those GP races, but again, not averaging close to those point markers. So it kind of didn't help them a tremendous amount in those GP races. Now, he had one DNF in a sprint race and 2 DNFs in that GP races. So he only had 3 of the DNFs out of that 10 that they had altogether. Now we look at his teammate, Alonso. He started off in 9th last year, moved down to 10th this year, so only lost 1 position overall. So that's not horrible considering where that Aston Martin was this year. His average sprint qualifying position was 8.3, so right at the edge of those points. And he dropped down to that 12.5 on those sprint races due to those DNFs as well in that mix. So he didn't quite stay up there into those points on average, dropping out of the points, which didn't help him or the team in that regard. Now, its average starting position in the GP races was at 10.2. So again, right at that edge of that, point marker. And he dropped down to 11.9. So basically that 12th position on the GP races on average, but he was getting close to that point marker. So he got some points here and there, but just not on a consistent average basis throughout the season. Now he had 2 DNFs in the sprint races and 5 DNFs in the GP races. So that kind of hurt them again, and that kind of falls into that suit where he had a lot of DNFs, which, it didn't help them, whereas Stroll was kind of inconsistent. He was more consistent, but, with those DNFs, pushed him back down in the field and the constructors' standings for those drivers as well. And here we compare the 2 Aston Martin drivers in those 6 sprint races, and this is where they ended up until you can kind of look at that, and you can kind of look at those trend lines to figure out how well they're doing. And of course, the going down is the better trend line because that shows you what the position that you finish those sprint races in. So you can see Stroll was, started off fairly strong, but then got weak at the end, whereas Alonso's didn't do that great in that, mid-pack. Did really good at the very beginning, but dropped off for those next 3 races and then came back for those next 2. So he kind of has a nice downward trend line, which is saying he was getting better throughout the season, even though it's kind of a weird look on this graph. But you can kind of compare and see how well they did against each other in these 6 sprint races and how they performed. And of course, we're going to compare Lance Stroll to Yuki Tsunoda and Esteban Ocon, the drivers that kind of finished the Drivers' Championship around him in these 6 sprint races. So you can kind of look at that and kind of figure out how well he did against those drivers close to him in that ranking. So you can see here, Lance Stroll, of course, was getting worse throughout the season, whereas Yuki Tsunoda and Esteban Ocon were probably getting a little bit worse, but not really drastically. It's pretty steady across the line on those trend lines, so kind of averaging out throughout this season. Now, yes, you can see some ups and downs for all 3 drivers, and that didn't help them at all in this run, but you can kind of look at those trend lines a little bit better to try to figure out what was going on in those seasons and how well those cars were getting adapted to those races and how the drivers were adapting to those cars as well. And of course, here we're looking at Fernando Alonso and comparing him against Nico Hülkenberg and Carlos Sainz, those drivers around him in the Drivers' Championship. So here you can look and you can see that Nico Hülkenberg was pretty steady on those sprint races, getting slightly worse on that trend line, but kind of pretty steady around that level or that place 15 marker. Whereas Fernando Alonso and Carlos Sainz were getting better, with Carlos just edging, Alonso out on that trend line, getting a little bit better, quicker across the season in these sprint races. But you can kind of look at that and kind of figure out where each of those drivers were, like, Belgium and Austin, where Carlos did really well, and Fernando Alonso didn't do so good in those 2 races, but then came back in Brazil, where Carlos was having a little bit of issues, and they kind of came close together in Qatar, where they were ended up on the end of the season. And here we see, the two Aston Martin drivers compared to each other in the GP races and where they finished up in those GP races. And you can see like here, like in Spain, where Lance Stroll did not actually start that race because of his hand, and he was, didn't actually participate in that race due to that injury. But you can kind of compare the other, races and kind of compare where each of those, team members finished those races and kind of get an idea of how that Aston Martin performed in the whole season, as those cars were, the same for the most part, and so you can have to adapt to the drivers for those cars and those tracks to figure out which ones, was better at each of those tracks. And here you can, of course, again, see Fernando Alonso's, trend line going down, which is a good thing, because that means he's getting to a better, more top position at the end of those GP races at the end of the season, versus Lance Stroll was just getting slightly worse throughout the season, where I think he kind of gave up on that car, and so he didn't quite get the effort and the performance that he needed out of that Aston Martin. And here we're going to look at Lance Stroll and compare him to Yuki Tsunoda and Esteban Ocon in just those GP races. So this is where they finished up in those GP races for each of those races, and kind of get an idea of how well he compared against those two drivers around him, the one that finished a little bit ahead of him and a little bit behind him in those drivers' championships. So you can kind of get an idea how well he really stacked up against those two drivers. And they're pretty similar on those trend lines, with Lance Stroll, getting slightly worse throughout the season, whereas Yuki Tsunoda and Esteban Ocon were getting slightly better, but with Esteban Ocon being closer to being a steady line across that, season, giving you a nice even pace throughout the whole season, not gaining really a lot of ground and not losing a lot of ground either in that regard. But Yuki Tsunoda getting slightly better, getting used to that Red Bull after getting switched over to the full team in this season. So that's why he started off a little bit late in this graph, as he didn't include those two races that he was with Racing Bulls on. So here you can kind of get an idea, again, where they compare to each other, and those are the finishing positions, and how well and close they were compared to each other. And if we do the same thing with Fernando Alonso here, we can compare him against Nico Hülkenberg and Carlos Sainz in those GP races, and kind of figure out where each of those drivers ended up compared to each other. And of course, we still see Nico Hülkenberg with a nice, steady trend line across the board around that 13th place marker, whereas Carlos Sainz started off fairly poorly, closer to that 15th, 14th place, but is getting better, closer to that 10th marker by the end of the season on that trend line. And Fernando Alonso actually getting better as well, starting closer to that 15th marker, but ended up definitely just past that 10th place marker by the end of the season on the trend line, graph in the average positioning. So that kind of shows you how well he was getting more out of that Aston Martin by the end of the season. Comparing him to Carlos Sainz, who was doing a really good job of getting his feet back into that Williams, trying to figure out how that Williams is driving, and had some really good runs there. And so you can kind of compare him against Fernando Alonso in that Aston Martin, and how well he was able to get the most out of that Aston Martin throughout this season. And here we're comparing the two Aston Martin drivers against each other and looking at where they got their points on each of the races, and trying to figure out those trend lines on those point markers. So this time the trend line going up would be better, because that's means the more points you're getting throughout this season. And so again, you can see Stroll starting off strong, but weakening as the season went on, whereas Fernando Alonso started off pretty poorly and got better that mid-season, and at the end of the season, still getting some general points in that, so his trend line's going up quite significantly in that regard. So you can kind of see how those two teammates compared to each other for those points and where they got their points in, and kind of figure out how well they did in general. And here's the step graph of those points, just to give you a better view of how the season went. So you can see that Stroll start off really strong, getting some points straight off the bat, but then kind of flattened out through that mid-center part where he got a few more points, but Alonso was really picked up in that Spain area and started moving forward with points from that point forward, gained the ground, fighting a little bit with Stroll in that mid-season pack of who was actually leading the points for that team, but by the end it was quite significantly more Alonso over Stroll. And now we jump over to the team comparison. So this is the sprint races for Aston Martin compared to Haas and the Racing Bulls. And you can kind of figure out where they got their points in these sprint races and look at those trend lines. So we're going back to the point markers and how they performed. And so you can see that Racing Bulls started off strong and kind of got weaker in those sprint races, where Aston Martin was getting better by the end of the season on those sprint races. And Haas had that nice middle spike, so they were going down by the end of the season, but had that good point marker in Belgium for them. And if we want to look at that as a step graph, this is kind of how that showed off. So we can basically see that Racing Bulls started off strong in China, but kind of leveled off quite significantly in those sprint races, where Aston Martin kind of came back in Miami, gaining some ground, passing up Racing Bulls, and of course ahead of Haas as well at that point in time, until they hit Belgium, where Haas jumped ahead of both of those teams. And then of course Aston Martin picked it up in Brazil and Qatar, as well as getting ahead of Haas. And now we dive into the GP races. So this is not including the sprint races, this is just the GP races and where they got their points. And you're looking at the full races. So this is the big point general marker for them, because this is where they got most of their points, as they get a lot more points in the GP races over the sprint races. And so this is really what counts in general. And you gotta look at those three teams and kind of figure out how they performed against each other and where they got their points. And you can see that all three teams are going up on those trend lines, so that's good. By the end of the season, they were getting more points than the beginning of the season, but it wasn't super significant in that regard, especially compared to each other in that setting. And you can kind of see that the Racing Bulls picked it up in kind of Monaco and had some really good runs, with Aston Martin right there at the Hungary mark, getting some extra points in that regard. And Haas starting off decently, but kind of dropped it off in the middle and came back a little bit after Coda in that regard. And just looking at those GP races and those points, this is the main graph that you'll kind of normally see. And so you can kind of see this, and we'll compare these with the full points here in a second. But you can see that Haas jumped up into the lead significantly early, but then kind of tailed off through that mid-season before coming back and potentially putting up a fight with Aston Martin. Whereas Racing Bulls started off pretty slowly, but kind of get that midfield, and the end they gained a lot more points than the other two teams, but still fairly close overall. But you kind of see where the ebbs and flows were for these three teams. And this is where you get your magnifying glass out and kind of get your, can you remember what's changed between the two images? So if you go back and compare the GP races graph with this full point graph, this is where they get points for both the GP races and the sprint races combined. And so this is fairly slightly changed here. You can basically see that Aston Martin and the Racing Bulls kind of merge on those trend lines in that graph. So they're getting fairly close together at the end of this season, which is interesting to see, as Haas is lagging a little bit behind, but still fairly close in that running. But the big interesting thing, I think, is those two trend lines for Aston Martin and Racing Bulls kind of really close together and kind of merging by the end of this season. And this is just the same data, but just in a stat graph format, so you can kind of see the ebbs and flows a little bit more with those sprint races involved in those 6 sprint races and how they flowed. Of course, with Haas only gaining that one sprint race point, but had a pretty decent point marker in that, whereas the Racing Bulls and Aston Martin had a little bit more races here and there in those sprint races to add to their score. So they kind of changed it slightly here and there, making it a little bit more tight on certain areas. But overall, you can kind of see where the Racing Bulls ended up compared to the Aston Martin, where he was really gaining some ground on those points. And so they may have had another race or two, may have overtaken the Racing Bulls. But of course, the season ended before that happened, so kind of pushed them into that marker where they were. So if you found this interesting and found that some of this data relevant and kind of intriguing on how these teams relate to each other and the drivers related to each other in those drivers championship, I'd appreciate a like. And if you want to see what's coming up next, which is the Racing Bulls deep dive, I would appreciate a subscribe as well. So, as again, next week we'll probably dive into the Racing Bulls and get a deeper dive into where they stood on the teams around them and the drivers around Isaac Hajjar and Liam Lawson. So until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.